Sheriff Wilbur Lang reached for the Bible at 12 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning in October of 1885, and the weight of it surprised him. The book was an octavo edition, bound in dark leather, 8.5 inches by 5.5, the kind issued by the American Bible Society to mission stations across the Western Territories for the better part of 3 decades. It should have weighed perhaps 18 ounces. It weighed in his hand closer to 2.5 pounds. He felt the difference the moment he lifted it. He did not, for a small interval, perhaps 3 seconds, say anything at all. He stood at the corner of the schoolmistress's desk, the Bible balanced flat across his open palms, and he made a small face. The face was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to recognition. A man who has carried weapons for 31 years can identify the weight of a concealed weapon through a layer of leather, binding the way a baker can identify the weight of unrisen dough. He looked up. Almira Krell, school mistress of the Redstone Valley. Schoolhouse, number 2, 26 years old, 3 years into her appointment, stood at the front of the empty classroom with her hands folded in front of her and a careful expression on her face. She had been expecting the visit. She had been expecting the visit for 9 months. She had not been expecting this morning that the visit would consist of the sheriff asking to borrow her Bible. She had been expecting any number of harder things, and almost none of them had been this. She said evenly, "Sheriff, there is something in the book," he said. "I noticed. May I open it?" She nodded once. He opened the Bible. He opened it not at the front cover, but at the place where his fingers, through the leather, had registered the discontinuity. He opened it to a section that fell roughly in the middle, between the Old Testament and the New, in the small interleaf the publisher had included for personal notes. The interleaf in this particular Bible had been carved out. The carving had been done carefully. Pages glued together along 3 sides to form a cavity, the edges of the cavity smoothed, so that from the outside the book closed flush. Inside the cavity was a Colt Model 1873 single-action revolver, .45 caliber, with the barrel sawed down to 4 inches. The pistol was loaded. Sheriff Lang looked at it for some time. He did not remove it. He turned the Bible slowly so that the inside of the cavity caught the morning light from the schoolhouse window. He examined the seating of the cylinder. He noted that the pistol had been recently cleaned and oiled. The smell came up from the page cavity, faintly but unmistakably. He closed the Bible. He set it on the desk. He said in the same level voice he had used at the door, "Miss Krell, will you sit down? I would like to know why you have been keeping a sawed-off pistol in a Bible on a schoolteacher's desk, and I would like to know it before I decide what to do about it." She sat down. She did not, however, answer his question yet. She had been preparing answers to that question for 9 months, the way a person prepares a will, knowing the document might be needed one day, but hoping it would not. She had 3 different versions. She had thought about each one in detail. She had not, until this morning, settled on which one she would deliver. She said, "Sheriff, before I answer you, I want to ask you something. Why did you come here this morning?" He sat down across the desk from her. He said, "I came to ask you whether you would let me borrow your Bible for an hour. I had a witness in the office across the square who needed to be sworn in for a deposition, and the Bible we keep at the office got damaged last week when the stove flue cracked. I knew you had one. I came over," she said. "That is all," he said. "That is all." She nodded slowly. She breathed out, a small breath, almost unnoticeable, that contained, compressed inside it, 9 months of waiting and the slow realization that the discovery had been an accident rather than an arrival. She said, "Then I will answer your question." She did. The answer took an hour and 20 minutes. Almira Krell had been born in 1859 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the eldest of 2 daughters of a Lutheran minister named Conrad Krell and his wife, Greta. She had been raised in a household where books and discipline were both abundant and where physical danger had been until she was 22 years old, a thing that happened to other people in other places. She had come west in 1881, after her father's death and her mother's remarriage, because her younger sister had inherited the small house in Eau Claire, a stipulation of the new stepfather's contract, and because Almira had no particular wish to live as a permanent guest in a house that was no longer her family's. She had answered an advertisement in a Lutheran teaching journal for a school mistress position in the Redstone Valley of the Wyoming Territory. She had been offered the position. She had taken it. She had arrived in Wolf Creek in the spring of 1882. She had taught at Schoolhouse No. 2, a small clapboard building 3 miles east of the town, serving the children of the ranches in the lower valley for the first 3 years. She had been, by all accounts, an excellent teacher. The trustees of the school had renewed her contract twice without discussion. In January of 1885, she had been called to testify in a criminal trial. The trial was held in Cheyenne. The defendant was a man named Ash Druitt, who had been arrested in November of 1884 for the murder of a freight clerk in Wolf Creek. The freight clerk, a young man named Otto Brem, 21 years old, recently engaged, had been shot through the chest at close range outside the freight office on the evening of November 12th. Druitt had been seen in the area. He had a previous record. He had been arrested within 48 hours of the killing and had been held in the Cheyenne Territorial Jail awaiting trial. Almira Krell had been called as a witness because she had, by coincidence, been walking past the freight office on the evening of the killing. She had heard the shot. She had been perhaps 30 yards away. She had not seen the shooting itself. She had seen, however, a man running from the rear of the freight office, and she had been close enough to see the man's face by the light of the lamp at the corner of the building. She had identified Ash Druitt. She had identified him, at the trial, by name and by a small physical detail, a notch in the man's left ear that he had carried since childhood. And her identification had been the single most damaging piece of evidence in the prosecution's case. The jury had convicted. Ash Druitt had been sentenced to 15 years at the Laramie Territorial Prison. He had not gone quietly. What was reported in the Cheyenne newspapers the following morning was that the convicted man had, upon hearing his sentence, addressed the courtroom in a calm and unhurried voice, and had directed remarks to Almira Krell specifically. The remarks had been, by the Cheyenne Daily Sun's description, of such a character as not to be reproduced in this publication. The remarks had concerned in detail what Druitt intended to do to Miss Krell when he was released, or when he escaped, whichever came first. 3 deputies had needed to restrain him, to remove him from the courtroom. Almira had returned to Wolf Creek that afternoon. She had taught her class the next morning. She had not, in the months that followed, mentioned the courtroom episode to anyone in the valley. She had, however, gone to a gunsmith in Cheyenne, on a trip arranged 2 weeks after the trial, ostensibly to visit a Lutheran cousin, and she had purchased the Colt revolver. She had paid $16 for it. She had paid an additional $4 to have the barrel sawed down to a length that would fit inside the modified Bible she had been preparing since the day of the sentencing. She had carried the Bible and the pistol inside it every day for 9 months. She had not, in those 9 months, removed the pistol from the Bible, except to clean it and reload it once per fortnight. She had not told anyone in the valley about the pistol. She had not in particular told the sheriff. What the Cheyenne newspapers had not reported, and what the prosecutor in the case had not been able to disclose to the court without violating the rules of evidence, was that Ash Druitt had been suspected, before the freight clerk's killing, of 2 other killings in the territory. Neither of the earlier killings had been provable to a standard sufficient for prosecution. Both had been done in the same way, a single shot from close range, no witnesses, the victim left where they fell. The 2 earlier victims had also testified. or had been preparing to testify in cases involving Druitt. The pattern, in Almira's view, had not been ambiguous. She had also known something else that the newspapers had not reported. She had known it because the deputy who had taken her statement in November of 1884 had mentioned it in passing in the kitchen of her boarding house 2 days after the trial concluded. He had mentioned it in the manner of a man who was concerned for a woman's safety and who believed she had a right to know what she was carrying. The deputy had told her this, that Ash Druitt's older brother, a man named Carroll Druitt, also known as Carr, had a reputation in the territory for finishing what his brother had started. He had been suspected, the deputy said, of intervening on his brother's behalf in 2 prior incidents, both involving witnesses who had subsequently disappeared. There was no proof. There was the kind of pattern that produced an ordinary citizen's certainty without rising to a sheriff's evidence. Carr Druitt was free. He was somewhere in the territory. He had not been seen near Wolf Creek in the months since the trial. He had been seen 3 weeks before Almira's 9-month conversation with Sheriff Lang in a saloon in Laramie, asking certain questions about the schoolhouse system in the eastern part of the territory. The information had been received by the Laramie sheriff and transmitted through proper channels to Wilbur Lang in Wolf Creek. Lang had filed the information. He had not, in his judgment, possessed enough evidence to act on it formally. He had, however, doubled the frequency of his rides past Schoolhouse Number 2, and had asked one of his deputies to be available within 30 minutes of the school during ordinary hours. He had not told Almira about the Laramie report. He told her now. He told her in his level voice, across the desk with the modified Bible between them. He said, "Miss Krell, I am going to be plain with you. Carr Druitt is in the territory. He was seen in Laramie 3 weeks ago. He has been asking the kind of questions that make me believe his intentions toward you are not friendly. I have not told you this before today because I did not wish to alarm you without specific cause. I had also, I will admit, no idea you had been preparing for him by yourself." He looked at the Bible. He said, "I wish to God you had told me. I would have arranged different protection. I would not have had you sitting in this classroom for 9 months with a sawed-off pistol on the desk and the door unlocked and the windows facing the road. That is not a defense plan. That is a posture. A posture can become a defense in the moment it is needed, but it will not by itself save your life." He paused. He chose his next sentence with care. He said, "Miss Krell, I would like to ask you for 2 things. The first is your permission to relocate you temporarily to a more secure location in the town. The second is your permission to borrow your pistol for a specific purpose I will now explain." She listened. She did not interrupt. She had spent 9 months expecting to face Carr Druitt alone, with no help she had not built for herself. The sheriff's offer of help was the first new fact in her situation in 9 months, and she allowed herself 30 seconds. A length of time she counted by the slow ticking of the schoolroom clock on the back wall to absorb it. Then she said, "Tell me about the pistol first." Sheriff Lang's plan was not elegant. He admitted this at the start. He said it had been formed in the last 20 minutes, while he had been sitting across from her, and that it had been formed under conditions of incomplete information and would require both her cooperation and her willingness to risk a confrontation that he would have preferred to avoid. The plan, in brief, was this. Carr Druitt had been asking questions about the schoolhouse system in the Eastern Territory. He had been doing so for several weeks. He had not, however, been seen in the immediate vicinity of Wolf Creek. The Laramie Sheriff's assessment, which Lang shared, was that Druitt was working slowly, gathering information, and would arrive in Wolf Creek only when he had identified the schoolmistress's routine to a degree that would allow him to act with the confidence of a man who had planned every step. What Lang proposed was to accelerate the encounter. He proposed to use a piece of information published carefully in a single line in the Cheyenne Daily Sun, that would draw Carr Druitt out of his patient observation and into an action he had not yet decided to take. The information would be a small article describing a transfer of school property in Wolf Creek, naming schoolhouse number 2 as the location, naming Miss Almira Krell as the teacher involved, and noting that she would be present at the schoolhouse on the afternoon of October 19th to receive a state inspector who would be traveling alone. The article would be false in only one particular. The state inspector would not be traveling alone. The state inspector, in fact, would not exist. The schoolhouse would, on the afternoon of October 19th, contain Almira Krell at the front of the classroom and Sheriff Lang and his 2 best deputies hidden in the small storage room at the back, behind a curtain that could be drawn aside in less than 2 seconds. Almira would be armed. She would be armed with her own pistol, which Lang would return to her, cleaned and fully loaded, for the occasion. The reason for the borrowing, Lang explained, was simple. He had not, in his 9 months of preparation for an eventual confrontation, been able to count on the schoolmistress as a participant in any plan he had made, because she had not informed him that she possessed the means or the willingness to act. He had been planning for the protection of a defenseless woman. He was now planning for the protection of a woman who had been carrying a sawed-off Colt revolver for 9 months, and had been waiting, with whatever resolve a person required for such a thing, for the chance to use it. That changed everything. It changed in particular the deputies' positions. It changed the placement of cover. It changed the angle of fire. It changed the calculation of what Carr Druitt, walking into the schoolhouse, would see in the first 3 seconds. A woman at her desk, the Bible open in front of her, the cavity face down, so he would not notice the modification until it was too late. It also changed, Lang said, the question of what to do with Druitt if the encounter went the way he expected. The original plan, drafted before he knew of the pistol, had assumed an arrest. The new plan could accommodate, if necessary, a self-defense outcome that would not require any further trials, any further sentencings, any further reasons for the Druitt family to seek out Almira Krell in the years ahead. He did not phrase this last point delicately. He phrased it as it needed to be phrased. He was a sheriff, not a counselor. Almira listened. When he had finished, she said, "I will agree to all of it, with one change." He said, "Name it," she said. "I will not sit with the pistol in front of me at the desk. I will sit with the Bible closed as I always do. He has been watching me for weeks. He knows what my desk looks like. He has, I am certain, asked questions about whether the schoolmistress in Wolf Creek carries a weapon, and he has been told, accurately, until this morning, that I do not. The encounter has to begin the way every other encounter in my classroom has begun, with the Bible closed." Lang nodded. He said, "Then it will begin that way." It was a 4-line item buried in the local civic announcements section, where it would draw no particular attention from ordinary readers, but would be visible to anyone scanning the paper systematically for references to the Wolf Creek schoolhouse system. The notice ran for 2 consecutive editions, Saturday and Tuesday, in order to maximize the chance that Carr Druitt, who had been moving between several towns in the territory, would see it. The bait was, as Lang had designed it, calibrated to be just plausible enough to be true, and just specific enough to be useful. In the 9 days between the publication of the notice and the afternoon of the planned confrontation, Almira Krell continued to teach her class. She taught arithmetic, reading, and the small amount of geography the curriculum permitted. She did not alter her routine in any observable way. She arrived at the schoolhouse at 7:30 each morning. She left at 4:30 each afternoon. She walked, as always, the half-mile back to her boarding room in Wolf Creek along the public road, where 2 of Lang's deputies, by arrangements she could not see, were always within calling distance. She slept poorly during the 9 days. She did not tell anyone that she was sleeping poorly. She had been sleeping poorly for 9 months, and the additional pressure of the planned confrontation did not so much change the quality of her sleep as it intensified the quality she had been carrying. She had become, over those 9 months, the kind of person who could be ready to defend her life at any moment of any waking hour. The 9 additional days were merely the same condition, continued at slightly higher pitch. She also did, in the 9 days, something she had not done in the 9 months. She wrote a letter. The letter was to her younger sister in Eau Claire. She had not corresponded with her sister regularly. There had been a coolness between them since their mother's remarriage. But the letter she wrote in the second week of October was 4 pages long, and contained, in plain language, an account of everything that had happened to her in the previous 12 months. The trial, the threats, the pistol, the Bible, the sheriff's plan, the afternoon of the 19th. She did not mail the letter. She placed it in an envelope, addressed it to her sister, sealed it, and gave it to her landlady, a widow named Mrs. Marek, whom she had grown to trust, with instructions to mail it on the morning of the 20th, if Almira had not returned to the boarding house by that time. The letter was, she explained to Mrs. Marek, a kind of insurance. She did not say against what. Mrs. Marek, who had been a widow long enough to recognize the shape of certain kinds of preparations, did not ask. On the morning of the 19th, a Monday, Almira walked to the schoolhouse at her usual time. She taught the morning session as planned. She dismissed the class at noon, on the publicly announced pretense that the afternoon would be reserved for the sedate inspector. She ate a small lunch alone in the schoolhouse. She read a section of Pilgrim's Progress, her father's old copy brought from Wisconsin, for 30 minutes. At 1:30, Lange and his 2 deputies arrived. They came on foot, through the back, by a small path that ran behind the schoolhouse. They took their positions in the storage room. The curtain was hung. The visibility through the curtain was tested. The angles of fire were confirmed. The Bible, Almira's Bible, with the pistol cleaned and reloaded and seated in the cavity, was placed on the desk in its usual position. At 2:15, Almira sat down at the desk and opened a primer in front of her. She waited. At 2:48, the front door of the schoolhouse opened. A man stepped inside. She did not look up immediately. She turned the page of the primer. She let him cross half the room before she raised her eyes. Carr Druitt was a thinner man than his brother. He was perhaps 3 inches taller. He was 41 years old. He was wearing a dark coat that had been brushed clean for the occasion, and a hat with a wide brim that he did not remove when he entered the schoolhouse. He stopped at the 3rd row of desks. He said, "Miss Krell." Almira looked up. She said, "Mr. Druitt." His face moved slightly. Not a flinch, not a recoil, but a small involuntary registration of the fact that she had known his name before he had given it. He had not expected that. He had expected, Lange would later analyze, to be in control of the introduction. He said, "You know who I am," she said. "I know who your brother is. The resemblance is enough." He took 2 more steps forward. She did not stand. She did not reach for the Bible. She kept her hands flat on the desk, on either side of the primer, in the same position they had been in for the past 40 minutes. She said, "Mr. Druitt, I want to give you the opportunity to leave this schoolhouse without doing whatever it is you came here to do. I am going to give you that opportunity exactly once. I am going to give it to you because I am a Lutheran, and because my father, who was a minister, would have wanted me to. Whether you accept the opportunity is your business. What follows from your decision will also be your business." He stared at her. He stared at her for a length of time that, in Lange's later report, was estimated at between 4 and 6 seconds. The deputies behind the curtain, both with pistols drawn, both with clear lines of fire, held their positions. Carr Druitt reached slowly into the inside of his coat. Almira's hand moved to the Bible. She opened the cover with the speed of a person who had practiced the motion. The Bible fell open at the cavity. Her hand closed on the grip of the Colt revolver. She did not lift the gun out of the cavity. She rotated the entire book on the desk so that the cavity faced Druitt, and she fired one round through the cavity, through the open page cover, and into the upper left chest of Carr Druitt, at a distance of approximately 15 feet. The shot was followed, perhaps a half-second later, by 2 more shots. One from each deputy from behind the curtain that struck Druitt in the upper torso and the right shoulder. He went down. He was dead before he hit the floor. The pistol he had been reaching for was a small Smith & Wesson revolver, Model 2, that had been found in his coat after the shooting. It had been loaded. It had not, however, cleared the coat. Whether he had been intending to use it in that moment or in some later one, no one could be certain. The coroner's inquest 3 days later ruled the shooting justifiable on the part of all 3 participants, with particular commendation for the school mistress, whose preparation and steadiness, under conditions that would have undone most experienced peace officers, had made the outcome possible. Almira Krell did not cry at the inquest. She had cried at the boarding house the night of the shooting, in private, with the landlady sitting in the kitchen and not asking questions. She had not cried since. She returned to the schoolhouse the following Monday and resumed teaching. The Bible was not returned to the desk. It went, instead, into a small wooden chest at the back of her boarding room closet, where it remained, with the pistol still in its cavity, for the rest of her life. The Bible came back to Almira's possession 9 days after the inquest. Sheriff Lang brought it himself in the early evening to the boarding house. He had cleaned the pistol again. He had reloaded it. He had repaired the small powder burn that the discharge had left on the inner cavity cover, using a piece of pasted-over leather that matched the original binding closely enough that the modification would not be noticed by anyone who had not been looking for it. He had also added something to the Bible. The addition was small. It was a single sheet of paper, folded once, tucked into the front cover behind the inscription page. The paper had been written on by Lang himself in his own hand, in pencil rather than ink, a detail Almira would later remark on, because pencil could be erased and ink could not, and the choice suggested that Lang had been uncertain, even after writing the note, whether he intended for it to be permanent. The note read, "Miss Krell, what you did at the desk was the most calm and competent piece of self-protection I have witnessed in 31 years of this work. I do not write that as flattery. I write it as fact. You have my apology for the 9 months in which I did not know what you were carrying. I should have known. I would have known had I been doing my work properly, the day you came back from Cheyenne. I am sorry I did not. If, in the future, you wish to keep the pistol in this Bible or in any other Bible, I will not, in my official capacity, take notice of it. I will, in my personal capacity, sleep more easily knowing that you have it. Yours, with respect, Wilbur Lang." She read the note in the small sitting room of the boarding house. She read it twice. She folded it. She returned it to the front cover of the Bible. She did not throw it away. She did not, in the years that followed, mention it to him directly. She mentioned it once in a letter she wrote to her sister in Eau Claire, the same sister to whom she had drafted the 4-page insurance letter, which had never been mailed and had been quietly retrieved from Mrs. Marrick on the morning of October 20th. The letter to her sister was shorter than the insurance letter, and contained, among other things, the sentence, "The sheriff here is a man whose handwriting I have decided not to lose." Almira Krell did not marry Wilbur Lang. It is important in telling this story to say that. Frontier narratives have a tendency to end every rescue in a marriage, and the tendency is mostly a literary one rather than an accurate one. Almira did not marry Lang. She did not marry anyone. She continued to teach at Schoolhouse No. 2 for 16 more years. She retired in 1901. She moved to a small house on the edge of Wolf Creek, where she lived alone, in considerable contentment, by all accounts, until her death in 1928 at the age of 69. She kept the Bible on her bedside table for 43 years. The pistol stayed in the cavity. The Bible is in a private collection now. It was donated on Almira Krell's death to a small Lutheran archive in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, by her niece, the daughter of the sister to whom she had written the unmailed insurance letter and the brief later note about the handwriting. The archive does not display the Bible publicly. It is kept in a climate-controlled storage drawer, along with several letters, a photograph of Almira at 25, and a brief biographical pamphlet written by her great-nephew in 1962. The pistol is still in the cavity. It is no longer loaded. The chambers were emptied at some point. The niece, perhaps, or the great-nephew, and the cylinder no longer turns smoothly, but the gun is otherwise intact. The note from Sheriff Lang is also in the archive. It is kept in a separate envelope in the same drawer, with a small index card noting its provenance. Wilbur Lang continued to serve as sheriff of Wolf Creek until 1894. He married in 1888 a widow named Constance Drilling, whose first husband had died of a horse fall the previous year. They had no children. They were married for 23 years before Lang's own death in 1911. Mrs. Lang survived him by 19 years. She knew about the Bible. He had told her about it on the night of their second anniversary, in the way men sometimes tell their wives about old episodes that have shaped them in ways their wives are entitled to know about. She had asked one question. The question had been whether the school mistress had been a person he had ever loved. He had said no, without offense, without defensiveness, as a simple matter of fact. He had added, "I respect her more than I have respected almost any person I have ever met. That is a different thing. There is a difference between respect of that kind and love, and the difference is the difference between a thing that does not require completion and a thing that does. I never sought completion from Almira. I sought her to remain exactly as she was. She has remained that way. I would not change a single morning of any of it." Constance Lang nodded. She had asked no further questions. She kept his answer for the rest of her life.